Well, I'd like to take a second to just welcome everybody back from what we hope was a productive morning. And again, we want to acknowledge that everything that's occurring today is on Treaty 6 territory and in the homeland of the Métis. My name is Shaun Brandt. I'm here to do a few MC-type things both this afternoon and then tonight. First things first, those of you who went to the EECOM AGM, I hope your meeting was as exciting as AGMs ever are. That's wonderful. Before we get rolling too much, we do want to thank some of our red-tailed hawk-level sponsors, the Dakota Dunes Casino, the City of Saskatoon, Tourism Saskatoon, the University of Saskatchewan Students' Union, the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation. Without these people's financial investment, we would be unable to put on events such as this, so we're very thankful to them. I would be remiss if I didn't one more time rewind the clock just a moment and reflect on what Sheila and Sylvia, our keynote address speakers from this morning, had to say. Anytime I get the privilege and the honor of hearing them speak, they always have a way of sort of reigniting that fire inside of me to keep fighting and you know, working as best we can to make sure that you know, these issues are part of the narrative of the classrooms or whichever groups that you happen to be working with. So I think we should maybe one more round of applause to this morning's keynotes. And we are moments away from our next very exciting keynote. But before we do that, it is something everyone's been waiting for, housekeeping announcements. Ooh. Alrighty. Thing number A. Tonight at Louis, right here on campus, which is very close, you don't need to drive or take a taxi anywhere, is the Sask Outdoors 50th birthday party. And you are all welcome and encouraged to attend. There is a sit-down meal as part of that event, and we also have Belle Plaine, some live entertainment and music coming. So we hope that everyone here will join us for the 50th birthday party tonight at Louis right here on campus. There has been, this is an interesting one. On the tables right outside the door, there's a Sask Outdoors table and there's a Seppin table, and there's a lot of what looks like swag. And it's always fun at these conferences to collect as much of the swag as you can. I do the same thing myself. However, somebody this morning collected too much swag. There were some things on the Seppin table that has the red tablecloth that need to be returned. So if you're a swag grabber and you think like, oh, I remember that table with the red tablecloth right outside these doors and I may have grabbed too many things, please come and find me just so we can see. There were a few reports that need to be used this afternoon, so we're really hoping that we can find those. I also have a couple of names on my hit list, but don't worry, I'm not hunting you down to chastise you. I would like to give you money, please. So Jade Ryan, if you're in here, and Alina Cowthorne, if you're in here, we have some checks that we need to get delivered out to you. So please come find myself or Zoe sitting in the front here. She's waving right there, and we can make that connection for you. Just checking to make sure that all of my T's are crossed. I believe they are. So it is now my honor to introduce to you, sitting in the front row here, Dr. Alex Wilson. She was spoken of this morning, and now we get to hear her speak in person. A member of the Ipcc Cree Nation. She spent a lot of her formal education in small schools you may have heard of, like Harvard. But now we are privileged that she is now a member of the Ed Foundation's faculty right here at the U of S, and I would like to invite her to come forward to introduce our keynote.
Thanks, Shaun. And Shaun is an alumni of our department of Ed Foundation, so good PR for the department. How's everyone doing? So this has been a really great conference, and I know talking with some of you last night how important this has been for taking the knowledge that you have and the practices that you've had in your own practice as educators and sharing with one another. And so today it's my great honor to be able to introduce a friend and colleague, Eriel Deranger. And I've known Eriel for probably about 6 years, and as many of you know, everybody knows about her if you've been working in this field for a number of years. Eriel is Dene Sulune from the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, which is in Treaty 8 territory. Although she did spend many of her formative years in this territory as well, so this is kind of a homecoming for her, so to speak. She's a mother of 2 children, and in her current position, she's the co-founder and executive director of the Indigenous Climate Action, as it says up there. But she has, before that position, held quite a number of positions actually throughout North America. Previously, she worked for the Indigenous Environment Network, the Rainforest Action Network, and more locally, the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, FSIN, here in Saskatchewan. She's the co-convener of one of the Indigenous Youth Caucuses at the United Nations. And most recently, she worked for 6 years in her home nation of Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation. So the common thread in all of the work that she's been doing for decades is this undying commitment to land defense, but not just land defense, also educating our own communities and educating the wider public about the multiple and intersecting impacts of tar sands, of oil extraction and extractive industries, and all the things that come along with that. And then, of course, the impact on climate change. So it's a real privilege and honor to have you here today, Eriel. And I know that when the conference organizers were looking for someone to be the keynote, your name came up right away, because we all respect you and are very humbled that you were able to come. So please join me in welcoming Eriel Deranger.
Sometimes I use a little bit of humor to try and loosen myself up, so you guys make me nervous. Eklanete, dene sotlene Eriel Tsekwe Hushe, Deranger Betsi Ini Hesli. My name is Eriel Tsekwe, and it's a Dene name, so Dene Sotlene, and my name means Thunder Woman in my language. And I always get to say, oh, I don't have a colonial name because my parents named me with a Dene, strong Dene name. But the joke is that my mom named me well because I'm loud like thunder. But I've actually sat on that for a while and thinking about my name as Thunder Woman. And thunder is the sound that's carried from the action of the lightning strike. And a lot of the work that I do is to carry the sound and of the actions of communities. And so I sit with my namesake and I try to carry it with dignity. So I also want to recognize and honor the traditional territory that we're on today, and recognize the many nations that live in the Treaty 6 territory around here, and I'm going to try and name them all. So it's the Kinistin First Nation, the Muscogee First Nation, the Muskeg Lake First Nation, Mistawasis, One Arrow, Whitecap, and Yellow Quill, which all live in a roughly 200 square kilometer radius of Saskatoon and represent over 11,000 Indigenous peoples in and around here, as well as the Métis settlements. So I want to honor and give thanks to those communities for allowing us to be here today. Don't need this. So when we think about where we are in place, we often think of our country through the, provinces, the boundaries, but this is as much as they can come up with a distinction, the tribal distribution in and near Canada at the time of contact. And I'd like to present this because I also want to recognize that we're not homogenous people. We are peoples. We are various and distinct, and we have different customs and cultures, languages. We have our own distinct systems of economics and our own distinct systems of education. But this is just to give you a rough idea. But in Canada, what we have now is we have a recognition, and we often think of Indigenous peoples of this continent and of this country through the distinction of history starting at the time of treaty and the time of contact. I'm going to go back here. Before contact, we had our own distinct territories and regions in which we lived. But this is how we often think of our maps. We think of it through the distinction of history starting at treaty making. We don't even talk about history starting at contact in Canada. We talk about it almost solely in the context of treaty. So I just want you to think about that for one moment, because yes, I'm a Treaty 8 member. I belong to the Treaty 8 nation. This is the Treaty 6 territory. But these territories were the territories of Cree, Métis, Saulteaux, Dene. Many different tribes lived within these areas before contact with our own distinct things. And the treaty-making processes happened hundreds of years after contact. Hundreds of years after contact. And within those hundreds of years, we have this premise that treaty-making processes in Canada were great. We were shaking hands, we were talking about how we were going to get along real great, and we were going to share the land, and look at all these wonderful promises that we put in all these treaty agreements. It's so great. But the reality is that colonization in the Americas was not a happy process. It was not one that was easy. When we signed treaty over 150 years ago in this country, in many places, it was after hundreds of years of the plundering of European colonists that came to this land to reap the bounties of the natural world. They came here with the premise and the ideology of man's dominion over nature, with terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery. But what actually existed in this country was thriving peoples with their own distinct languages, cultures, identities, cosmologies, and systems. And Indigenous peoples now today represent over 5% of the global population, with a roughly 370 million Indigenous peoples worldwide. That's over 5,000 distinct groups of people in over 90 different countries. And we have our Indigenous territories and lands encompass anywhere between 22 to 65% of the world's land surface. Guess how much land surface cities and urban centers take up? Anyone? Some. You're supposed to be educators. Engage with me. 2%? Anyone else? See, I knew the answer was going to be pretty bang on. It's between 2 and 3%. So between 2 and 3% of the world's surface is covered by urban centers, whereas Indigenous populations live with and live within and occupy between 22 and 65% of the world's land surface. And that becomes really critically important, because what we've seen in Canada is this ideology of sharing the land, peace and friendship treaties, sharing the land, Treaty 1s through 11, all these ideas that we're going to come together, we're going to co-manage, we're going to exist peacefully, but that's kind of all gone down the drain. Because instead of recognizing our traditional treaty territories, what's happened in this country is Indigenous people have been placed on reservations or reserve systems, where we actually only have the rights within the boundaries of our surveyed reserves, which actually only represents 0.2% of the land mass in this country. So 0.2% of the land mass is where we have the ability to govern ourselves. The other 99.8% is crown land. And so when you think about, going back, I'm going to go back to this first slide, this was our territory before contact. We had the full-scale management of all of these territories, and we lived here very well. And now we're relegated to this. And you start to see how colonization and the treaty-making process was not one to share the land. It was one in which they came here, and they didn't just come here to plunder the resources of this country, but they came here with this idea to not just take the land, but to come and devalue Indigenous cultures and cosmology, and in many cases to demonize them, to put them aside for their own what's the word I'm looking for? Their own, whatever they were doing, for their own interest. That's the word. I couldn't come up with the word interest. They came here with this interest, their own interest, to come for the bounty. And at first it was the fur trade, and then it became the agricultural benefits and the minerals. And we saw that the country they came here to not just do all of this, but they came here also, and they demonized and they devalued our systems, and they pushed them away. What's really interesting is that in the time of a climate crisis, oh yeah, sorry. This is a Frankenstein presentation, so some of my slides are a surprise to me. So, just thinking about the context of Indigenous culture, Indigenous peoples, our lands and our territories, the places in which we have resided since time immemorial, have deep, significant value to our communities. My nation is known as the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation because the Cree didn't know what to call us when the white people said, "Who are those people?" And they said, "They're the Chipewyans," which means pointy skins or pointy talkers. And that was because we wore pointy skins. The name of my nation, what we identify as, is the Kaitale Dene Sotlene people, which means people of the willow and people of the land. And that's a direct reference to where we live because we live in the Athabasca Delta, where the willows grow. And so many, many communities, when you go down to their traditional names of their communities, there's a direct correlation and link to the land. Because our culture, our identities, our cosmologies, our economic, our education, all of the deep, intricate parts of our societies were held within the values of our ecosystems. Everything from our food systems to our recreation and songs to the activities that brought us economics in our territory. And contrary to popular belief, my nation was a hunting and gathering nation because we were so far north. But contrary to popular belief, this was not some wild, wild country where nothing was happening. There were agricultural systems being built in eastern Canada. There were massive trade routes where people were trading spices and foods and clothing and goods and artifacts and art. And so this is not some antiquated system. And what we're seeing is as we're dealing with the climate crisis, we're now looking to those biological systems and looking at the value of those systems. So in Canada, from a science perspective, when we talk about climate change, we start to look at what is Canada's sort of carbon sequestration value. What's really interesting when we start to look at it, and science looks at it, they're like, oh wow, all of the land in this country has such deep, significance to the global climate community. And we're talking mainly about Canada's boreal forest. So the deepest sequestration value in the country comes from Canada's boreal forest. But if you look at the Canada's boreal forest from a different perspective, you can look at it from an Indigenous perspective. It is the home of the Dene, the Cree, the Anishinaabe, the Algonquin, the Inuit, the Mi'kmaq, the Tahltan. This is home to many Indigenous communities that have forged those same intimate relationships with the landscapes for a millennia, and they have protected those landscapes for a millennia as well. When we think about the great forests of the world and the value to the carbon or to the climate crisis, we often think about saving the Amazon. How many people have seen some ad about saving the Amazon rainforest? Right? How many people have seen ads about saving the boreal forest for climate change? Maybe like one or two. Yeah, they do exist, but no, there's no traction on them. There's no traction, and I don't understand. So we often talk about the Amazon as the lungs of the earth. Beautiful lungs of the earth. But lungs come in pairs. And the Amazon is the lungs of the southern hemisphere. And the boreal is the lungs of the northern hemisphere. And just to give you an idea of how similar they really are, the photo on the top is the Athabasca, where I live. The bottom is the Amazon rainforest. And I recently was in Ecuador, just last month, and not only are the ecosystems so similar and their significance to the global atmosphere and stabilization of our planet, but so are the people. And so me and this young man, Nigel and Henry Robinson, we get off the plane. We're in a village, an indigenous village in the Amazon for the Waroni people, and we were in this village called Nimumbai. And we get off the plane, and there's all these little kids, and there's elders, and there's people, and Nigel just turns to me, and he goes, "Holy, it's just like the res." except they can drink the water, except they can still feed themselves, except they still have their culture. So it's something to really think about. The cultural and biological significance of the great forests of the world is not just simply relegated to carbon sequestration value, but it does hold a significance. And Canada's boreal forest accounts for up to 22% of the global carbon sequestration, or 208 billion tons of carbon, or the equivalent of 26 years of global emissions. And per unit, Canada's boreal forest sequesters 2 times that of the Amazon. And yet we do not talk about protecting Canada's boreal forests in the same way, nor do we talk about protecting the culture and the peoples that live within those forests in the same way. So when we think about forests and their value and what that means and why I showed you all those slides about where Indigenous people live and how our land's been taken away, it actually has real meaning, because while we represent only 5%, we manage about 11% of the world's forests and customarily own and occupy, and we are basically the front lines to safeguarding up to 312 billion tons of carbon worldwide. And there have been international studies that have looked at how they have taken community-based forest tenure across 33 low and middle-income countries, representing 85% of the forests in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and increased by 40% between 2002 and 2017. The pace of recognition could more than double if existing legislation in 4 countries were combined. And we found that these forests, this forest stewardship led to an increase of carbon sequestration, an increase of the protection of the biodiversity in those regions when the land was given back to the communities. We talk a lot of game about truth and reconciliation. We talk a lot about giving acknowledgements. But the reality is First Nations peoples need to have control and management of their ecosystems, not just because it is a part of our identities, because we have been shown time and time again to be the best stewards for the lands and ecosystems of this planet. Climate change, it's no big deal, right? Yeah, we're just like, moving along, puttering along like everything's A-okay on this planet. But what's happening is that we're seeing that Indigenous peoples are not just experiencing the imposition of colonial policies to eradicate and erase us from the landscapes, or to demonize and devalue our systems of education. Now, those same systems which have created this destabilization of our atmosphere with rising temperatures and rising levels of atmospheric carbon in the atmosphere, our communities are now seeing that the same systems, these drivers of climate change, which has been largely led through the anthropocenic activities of people. And if you look at this, the anthropogenic footprint of Canada, it's touching mainly the southern part, but it's moving further and further into Canada's boreal forests. And because of that, Canada has become one of the leading deforesting nations in the world. And Natural Resource Canada will disagree with me on this one, and I know they will. And that's because they replace at the same rate young trees that they remove. And so they don't classify it as land disturbances or deforestation. And so we get into some semantics here, but we're actually deforesting at a faster rate as when you look at the hectares removed in Canada than we are in the Amazon rainforest. Again, what the hell? And the same communities that are fighting this deforestation in our communities are fighting against extractive industries. They're fighting against the logging industry. They're fighting against mines, oil and gas, fracking, mega hydro projects. And they're trying to protect the front lines of these valuable and critical ecosystems to our planet. So I'm just going to go over some of the drivers of climate change, just as a primer. As we got like burning fossil fuels. We got deforestation and land use changes. Not just deforestation, but land use changes are very important to talk about. Transportation, manufacturing and construction, agriculture and agribusiness, other fuel combustion, industrial processing, cement and aluminum, everybody. Keep this in mind. All these buildings are made out of cement. We wrap our food in aluminum foil all the time, but these produce some really noxious gas that are actually really concerning, and we think of them as just everyday use things, but we really need to be rethinking how we move in our society. Fugitive emissions, which are things like gas flares and other emissions associated with energy production. Waste. Our landfills are producing record-breaking amounts of methane. We have bunker fuels. And all of this is leading to the fact that our Earth is out of balance. We are out of balance with ourselves and with Mother Earth. And in order to address the climate crisis, we must restore our relationships with Mother Earth and with each other, and address this imbalance in all aspects of our lives. Now, thinking about all those drivers of climate change, how many of you think those drivers of climate change were created by Indigenous communities? None of you? What? No. And this is really important to think about, because when we talk about the drivers of climate change, Indigenous communities were not behind this ideology of man's dominion over nature, of consuming the great world. There's a really great author named Jack Forbes that has coined this idea that is called the wheat-to-goat disease. That is this, the wheat-to-go is an Algonquin word or deity, and it was the name of a spirit driven by greed, excess, and the desire to consume. And Forbes eloquently framed the wheat-to-go disease and colonization together when he stated, tragically, the history of the world for the past 2,000 years is in great part the story of the epistemology of the wheat-to-go disease. Colonization has come in this form to consume. They came here to consume the new world, and we have done that through the consumption of the goods in this country to produce all of this waste and destabilize our climate, but mostly we have destabilized our minds. We have severed those connections with our relationships to Mother Earth, and I consider myself very, very privileged. I am the first generation to not live on the land. I am the first generation in my family. I'm the first generation in my family to not speak my language. I am the first person in my family that is not a trapper or a hunter. But I grew up at least being connected to the land. I grew up with the ideologies and the cosmologies of Indigenous spirituality of all my relations. That the trees and the grass and the rocks and the rivers and all of the animals that lived here were my brethren. I was no better and I was no less. I was just simply a part of. And what we have as a problem in societies today is that we are so human-centric. We think humans are at the center of everything. We don't see ourselves as just another species in this ecosystem. And so when I talk about we are out of balance with ourselves and Mother Earth, is our egos have driven us. The wheat-to-goat disease has driven us to a place to think that we have the right to consume this world. So the impacts of climate change and on Indigenous lives and culture. I'm sure you've all seen these things before. We're seeing glacier melts like you wouldn't believe. We're seeing sea ice melting and coastal waters rising. We are seeing flooding. We are seeing droughts. We are seeing the Great Lakes not freezing and having as much sea ice, or not sea ice because it's not the sea. They're not seeing as much ice over the winter months, which is actually leading to more evaporation, which is actually supercharging all of these crazy rainstorms that we're having. But it's actually decreasing the quality of our Great Lakes. We're seeing raging forest fires. We're seeing melting ice in much of Canada, where many of our communities rely on ice roads. I come from a fly-in community. Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation is located in Fort Chipewyan, which is a fly-in remote community in northern Alberta. We rely on ice roads. And so when we see these things, they have huge implications on Indigenous communities. With the disappearing of road ice, we're seeing communities becoming isolated and not being able to get out. We're seeing increasing psychological impacts and suicide rates increasing in a lot of our remote communities. And climate change alone is expected to threaten extinction to 1/4 or more of all species. And I'm sure many of you heard in the last week. Did anyone hear how many animals are on the extinction list now? Over 1 million. Over 1 million animals. And so this actually changes our ability to have our ability to connect with those places that give us our identity, feed our souls, are being destroyed, not just through the appropriation of our lands for extractive industries, but now that threat is being increased and exacerbated by climate change, where we don't have clean water, where we don't have foods that we can eat anymore, and our food security is being destroyed, our water security is being destroyed, and our culture is being destroyed. And just to give you an idea of how we're seeing this, I'm going to give you some pictures from my own territory. These are ducks that have landed in the tailings ponds, the wonderful tailings ponds associated with the extractive industries, the largest single growing emitter in Canada. And that contamination from these toxic byproducts is leaching into our river systems and causing deformities in our fish. But on top of that, as workers come into our territories within the thousands, tens of thousands, up to 90,000 at the highest rate, you now have a bunch of people that have zero connection, zero understanding to the cultural significance of our landscapes coming into our territories, and now we're seeing increasing poaching of great species such as bison. So we're not just talking about this problem with consumption and energy. We are talking about a psychological disconnection from who we are as a species on this planet that is driving us further and further to the edge. And the people that are paying the most for this are Indigenous communities that were literally dying. I was at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues just 2 weeks ago, and we were talking about Indigenous languages. And of the over 5,000 Indigenous languages that are out there, one Indigenous language dies every 2 weeks. But here's the even more disturbing part. Nobody even knows which language is dying every 2 weeks because no one cares about those systems. And so we have to really be thinking about what are the systems that we're talking about? We're talking about pre-colonial ideologies, pre-colonial systems of education, pre-colonial systems of speaking and communicating with one another. That is what's disappearing along with the planet's security and climate. So education, Indigenous knowledge, and climate change. So the Ipcc report came out last year, and everyone was like, oh my God, we only have 12 years, we're gonna die. Oh my God, why didn't they tell us sooner? And I'm like, wait a second, like I was in Anchorage in 2009 at this summit, and like I was one of the facilitators helping to draft this. We wrote this report and this declaration called the Anchorage Declaration. It's really good, by the way. And part of it says, we are deeply alarmed by the accelerating climate devastation brought about by unstable. Basically, we're like, we need to do something right now. And the demands in the Anchorage Declaration are much higher than the Paris Agreement. Much higher. We wanted us to be 40% below 1990 levels by 2020. We're never going to get there. But we called for this in 2009. And yet we say Western science is telling us this. Western science is telling us this. Indigenous people have been raising the alarm on climate change for decades, if not centuries. And climate change poses threats and dangers to the survival of our communities. But we're not just merely victims. Indigenous peoples interpret and react to the impacts of climate change in creative ways, drawing on traditional knowledge and other technologies to find solutions that society at large can replicate to counter pending changes. So as we sit here and we struggle to find the answers to the climate crisis, we often look for the solutions within the confines of the very systems that have pushed us to the edge. We are trying to find solutions within the colonial ideologies, within the colonial capitalist systems, within frameworks that have supported and upheld systems of white supremacy while devaluing and demonizing other systems of understanding and being. If we are going to solve this crisis, it's going to mean that we have to open and expand beyond those systems. We have to break down systems of entrenched ideologies of white supremacy, of colonialism. And we have to move beyond those things, and that means opening the doors to other people, other ways of knowing and being. The Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair stated that our that it has brought to us today to a point where the psychological and emotional well-being of Aboriginal children has been harmed, and the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people has been seriously damaged. But education holds the key to making things better. And if we agree to work together, the work we do today will immeasurably strengthen the social fabric of Canada tomorrow. And this is where I think we have to push the boundaries of what we mean through education. And that comes down to this very foundational document called the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And the reason why this document is so critical and important when we think about it is it is the first UN convention, and the only UN convention at this point, in which Indigenous peoples had self-appointed representatives that drafted the language of this. It's the first UN convention. Even Canadian policy is not created with Indigenous representatives at the table. We are allowed to give our input, and then someone takes it away, and they make their final adjustments, and they do everything else. This is the first UN and international convention where Indigenous peoples were allowed to participate in drafting it. And at the foundation and the core of that document are the elements that put Indigenous people at the table, is that we want free, prior, and informed consent. We want to be able to freely be able to decide what happens, not just in our lands and territories, but what happens in our classrooms, the foods that we put in our body, and how we live and prosper on these lands and territories. And that even includes economic systems. Because a lot of people are like, oh, you are just trying to like go back to pre-colonial ways. You want to like live and, you know, live on the land and live in squalor, some people are like, so you want to go live in a teepee and have smoke signals? I'm like, first of all, I'm Dene. We didn't live in teepees, but thanks. And no, I don't want to do that. I have like a cell phone. I have a laptop. I'm a part of modern society. I'm a part of modern society. And I live in this sort of two worlds place. And our communities want to be a part of developing the new systems to address the climate crisis. And we want those new systems to include our rights. We want to be granted the ability to have free, prior, and consent over our territories and be given the recognition that has been shown that when we are given the ability to have jurisdiction and self-determination over our lands and territories, that we actually increase economies, local economies, not big GDPs, but local economies, and we increase the protection of our ecosystems. So the UN Convention, UNDRIP, that gets passed. In Paris in 2015, it was the first document since 2007 that recognized the importance of Indigenous peoples' rights and the knowledge of Indigenous peoples. So this is actually really critically important because when we talk about addressing the climate crisis, we can't just be getting stuck in these economic systems of we need to do an energy audit, we need to like think about our footprint, we need to think about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We need to do all of those things, and we need to be looking at how Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, how Indigenous people have lived and maintained and stewarded their lands, how Indigenous people's economic systems worked before contact, and how we can replicate and sort of merge those systems together. And so since Paris, a lot of work has been done, and a lot of folks have been fighting because they don't want their rights to be negotiated. We want to be given a seat at the table like we were in 2007. And there's this really big body, because the UN just loves their acronyms. It's called UNFCCC SUBSTA, but SUBSTA stands for the Subsidiary Body for Scientific and Technological Advice. It's basically the body that's trying to give all of the advice to the state leaders on what they need to do in order to actualize achieving the Paris Agreement's goals. And within that, the UN Indigenous Forum on Climate Change, because there is one, we advocated really hard to have the ability for us to sit at the table and give space for our knowledge and facilitate the integration of our systems into the implementation outlines for Paris Agreement. And we won. We won! Yay! So with that, they created something called the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform. And it said Indigenous people must be part of the solution to climate change. This is because you have the traditional knowledge of your ancestors. The important value of that knowledge simply cannot and must not be understated. You are also essential in finding solutions today and in the future. The Paris Climate Change Agreement recognizes it. It recognizes your role in building a world that is resilient in the face of climate impacts. And I think that that's really important to think about, because this body is the first time that Indigenous people got to self-appoint representatives since the UN DEC, the UN DRIP, and we are going to have a seat at the table at the next COP in Chile this winter. So it is the first time, and it's really, really critical. But what does that mean here? Because is that happening in Canada? Is that happening here? Are we having Indigenous people sitting down and planning how Canada is going to meet its pan-Canadian framework plan? We don't. It's relegated to national representatives within the AFN, the ITK, and the MNC. Sorry, I'm an acronym person. The Assembly of First Nations, I can't say ITK because I'm not Inuit and I'll butcher it, but it's the National Inuit Organization and the National Métis Council. Now, yes, those bodies are great, but we have to recognize that we are not homogenous, we are not pan-Indigenous, and that those organizations are advocacy organizations for us. They are not the official representations of our communities, and that we all have sovereign rights as Indigenous nations, and they need to be respected. And so we absolutely must push towards having more representation and better conversations about what it means to be a part of driving climate change mitigation in this country, including how we're going to achieve those things. So that's what I do. So Indigenous Climate Action has taken on this work. Obviously, I've been doing UN stuff for far too long. And I was really getting frustrated because there was all this great stuff happening at the international level. And it's really great stuff. But when it comes down to it, our communities still don't even know. The Indigenous communities don't understand the critical role that our culture and knowledge has in driving the conversation and the discourse around climate change, and not simply about adaptation. It is absolutely, we cannot relegate it down to adaptation and resiliency. Our communities are a part of mitigation. We are part of creating the strategies for mitigating and equalizing atmospheric stabilization on this planet. And so ICA decided we were going to do this. So we have gone forward to try and create something called the Climate Change Toolkit. And what we wanted to do is recenter Indigenous values, cosmology, and knowledge as the foundations for building and talking about climate change for communities to understand. It is about being able to see ourselves in the conversation. Because currently when we talk about climate change, we get stuck in this GHGs, energy audits, blah, 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 blah. And again, I'm sorry, that stuff's really important. It's really important. It really is. But we have to find a way to see Indigenous peoples in the conversation. Because colonization, residential schools, all of those things led to the removal of our communities from our lands and territories, and we are in a process of healing. And that healing requires us to be a part of the story, not just this other side story where we get to talk about all the bad things that happen, but we should be talking about all the good things that we have contributed to this country to make it what it is today. And what we are trying to do is host community workshops and work with communities where they're at. Talk to them about what they want, what they need, how they see themselves in the climate story. And yes, we talk about all the bad things that are happening, but then when we get to the end of our workshops and we say, what do you want to do in your community to mitigate climate change? Do you know what our communities are asking for? They're asking for revitalization of our language. They're asking for reconnecting to our traditional ways of knowing and being. We had young people say, we want to know our real history. We want to know our history before colonization. They want to know the very basic foundations of what it means to be connected to the land. And we say a lot, and we talk a lot about decolonization all the time. And what is decolonization? In its simplest, bare bones form, it is simply the return of and connection to land. So if we are real about decolonization, it's about giving our communities the rights to govern not just ourselves, but our lands and our territories. And it's about us as a species reconnecting with the sacredness of Mother Earth and our role as humans on this planet. So, to effectively address climate change, it's clear that Indigenous peoples must be vested with decision-making power to develop policies and mitigation strategies. And there needs to be a more robust process to adequately include Indigenous peoples in the development of all measures to understand climate change and reduce emissions. So I'm just gonna leave it with this last little piece because that's great, we should be doing that. But instead, what are we doing in this country? We're still developing things like Alberta's tar sands. We have a prime minister that on one side says climate action, on the other side says no country would find 173 billion barrels of oil in the ground and leave them there. He says First Nations can protest, but it's a done deal, and that we don't even have veto power, basically taking our rights and the foundations of UNDRIP away. And this is an industry that's associated with high levels of 31% more emissions than average crude oil. And we have communities not just fighting against this, but fighting against other infrastructure across the country, whether it's Alton gas, whether it's fracked gas, whether it's the community standing up. And all we're asking for is the recognition of our fundamental rights as Indigenous peoples and our rights as humans on planet Earth. So thank you, and masicho.
We do have just a couple of minutes for questions. If there's anyone out there that has a burning question, now is your chance.
Communities are facing over-criminalization. So perhaps if you could talk a bit about the role of RCMP in over-policing of Indigenous
Yeah.
and women in particular.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I didn't get into it too much. I know that Sylvia and Sheila talked about that in theirs, and I didn't want to get into it too much, but the reality is that within the environmental and climate justice movement, you have white activist organizations doing blockades, hanging off of bridges, and yeah, there's a bunch of fancy stuff, but you never see SWAT police come in and mow them down. But in the Unistoten territory, they were doing the exact same thing, trying to stop an oil and gas pipeline, and the RCMP with full force comes in. Saw the same thing in Standing Rock. And so what we've seen is that instead of giving accolades to Indigenous peoples as environmental stewards, as those that are paving the way for climate mitigation so that we can actually achieve our goals, because Canada has a goal, just so you all know. Canada's goal is called, in their deep decarbonization plan, is to get Canada to 150 megatons of emission annually. And the Alberta oil sands creates 100 megatons annually right now. And so we don't have a plan. So that means that 2/3 of the emissions will be taken up by one sector alone. And the communities that try to challenge that were considered criminals, were considered anti-development, and the type of police repression that comes down on us is to continue to criminalize us. And so there's really a dichotomy that we're, even within the environmental movement, we're seeing those tenets of white supremacy, that devaluing, that demonizing of Indigenous culture and knowledge, and that connection to land is woo-woo, it's not science. And during some of our work in our communities, an elder said, she just sat back and she goes, science is about observation, right? And I'm like, yeah. And she's like, if it's all about observation, Indigenous peoples are some of the best observers. So that makes us some of the best scientists. And we are some of the best scientists. There have been many different scientific, ecological science communities that have come to our communities, and when they work with us, it changes the values of what they're looking at. It changes the outcomes of their studies. Imagine what we could do if we stopped criminalizing Indigenous peoples for protecting their lands and looked at that as possible platforms and frameworks for mitigating emissions in this country. And the RCMP, as Sylvia and Sheila talked about, have an entrenched history country. The RCMP was created to basically control the native people in this country. If you ever want to read a really good book on the history of the colonization, it's mainly in the United States, but it gives you an idea of Canada a little bit, is Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, The Indigenous People's History of the United States. And Columbus and Other Cannibals by Jack Forbes is also a really great book. But the military, the police forces in the Americas were created to subdue and oppress Indigenous voice in this country and across the Americas. And there's no, we can't, that's why I'm saying, when we come up with solutions, we have to think beyond the structures that we currently have. We absolutely have to think beyond that. I'll leave with one last little story. When I was in Alaska, there was an elder that talked about how the people, in order to survive the last ice age, the Indigenous peoples came together and they dropped their wars, they dropped their disputes, and they came together to share their knowledge, to share their understandings and deep relationships with the natural world in order to find ways that they could replicate in their own communities to survive the ice age. But it was prophesized at that time that another time of great change would come on the land, and it would require more of us to drop our disputes, to drop our egos, to drop all of those things and come together and share our knowledges to find the solutions that we could replicate to save humanity. And that's where we are today. So we have to move beyond what we currently see and think, and how you as educators, my challenge to you as educators, how can you expand your toolkits to include Indigenous knowledge in a way that is not tokenistic, but is actually reflective of our value systems. So, thank you.
Well, just another incredible, thought-provoking keynote. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us this afternoon.